Welcome to Focus. I'm Deborah Palmer. Today's show deals with grief, but more importantly, deals with the hope and the strength to overcome that grief. So many times we ourselves and others we know have suffered losses, whether it's a child, a parent, a friend, or it could even be a puppy, or we may find out we have a terminal illness. We pick up the paper, we see a suburb fireman killed in blaze, Haitian boat sinks, 33 die, and again, we see on the next page, IRA blast kills 1 in restaurant. These are senseless. This is innocent killing. And how do you explain to the members of these people's family, why it happened? How do you console them? So many times they ask, why did it happen to me? I've been good all my life. Why us? Why did God let this happen to us? Well, Rabbi Harold Kushner, who himself suffered the loss of his son Aaron, went through the same experience and has written a book in response to it, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And he will try and give us some hints to consolation and what people actually experience. Nice to have you with us,
Deborah,
Rabbi.
thank you.
First, how did you come to grips? How did you explain to yourself what was happening when you found out that Aaron was actually dying?
When Aaron was 3 years old, we found out that the growth problem we had taken to a doctor to explain was a very serious one, that he would die in his early teens and not have a physically normal body between age 3 and when he died around 12 or 13. We responded the way I think any normal person would, very hurt, very angry, very confused. This wasn't the way the world was supposed to work. We felt that we had kept our half of the bargain with God. We had been good, honest, religiously observant people, and that God had let us down with his end of the bargain. And for a moment, I not only had a personal dilemma of knowing that my son would die, I had the professional dilemma of not being sure I could continue as a rabbi. Did I still believe what I had been taught to believe in seminary? Could I continue telling people to come to services, to live an observant life? I was facing this double crisis. Maybe the worst part was when people offered me the same explanations, the same words of consolation that I had been offering as a rabbi. I discovered for the first time how hollow they were. They really were not very comforting.
What were these words? What are the words we usually hear?
People would tell me, God has his reasons for it. It must be part of some grand design. God must have singled you out because you're strong enough to bear it. People would say, it's not so terrible, it'll work out. There are other people suffering worse fates. They meant well. It really was not very comforting at all.
Would anything have comforted you then?
Nothing would have replaced what we had before. Nothing would have kept bad things from happening to Aaron. But yes, I think I've learned what does help. What helps, Deborah, is people saying that they care, people offering comfort and reassurance instead of offering explanations. When I wrote my book and when I wrote the title, by the way, I find that I can't walk around with that book without somebody stopping me and saying, hey, I ought to read that. That sounds like the story of my life.
Yeah.
I was tempted to call it Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, and I didn't, because I don't know why. And also because why things happen isn't really the issue. It focuses on all the wrong things. It focuses on the past. It's a question that can't be answered. I think the biggest mistake that we make, and especially the biggest mistake that religious people make, when somebody says, how could God let this happen to my family? We try to defend God. You know something? God doesn't need our defense. First of all, he's strong enough to handle things by himself. Secondly, the conclusion I came to was that God does not cause these things. God doesn't make children born deformed or retarded or doomed. When we stop defending God, when we stop explaining God because people who suffer don't want explanations, when what we offer is not theology but comfort and reassurance, when we tell people that we care about them, that's the most helpful thing anybody can do. none of the explanations, none of the books of theology, none of the confused, convoluted, tortured explanations of why God was doing this did us any good. What did us good were people who went out of their way to include Aaron in their family plans, to do things for him.
Excuse me, how long did it take for you to actually come to this reasoning?
I really don't remember it. You know what, Deborah? It comes and goes. You're doing well, and then something will happen and throw you, and you'll be down, and you'll pick yourself up, and you'll do well again for a while. It goes in a wave. It's up and down all the time. There isn't a day when you say, well, I've solved that problem, put it behind me.
In the book, you talk about that people shouldn't blame God about having these things happen to him. It's God who gives one the strength. How did God come to you during Aaron's illness?
God came to me through people. The only way God becomes real in the world, or the main way, is through people. I quote a Hasidic rabbi who says human beings are God's language. God speaks through good deeds, helpful, generous deeds that other people do. There was the man who saw Aaron trying to play tennis with me one day and saw how awkward this 3-foot-high child the size of a 3-year-old was handling even a light tennis racket. And without telling anybody, he had a scaled-down tennis racket made. There was the time Aaron played the violin because we knew he'd never be an athlete, and we wanted him to be able to do something well and something to keep his hands limber as the arthritis set in. We needed a string for his violin. We were in New York City. We went to the biggest music supply store in all of New York City to get a string. The daughter of the owner of the company saw this tiny little bald child with a tiny child-sized toy violin. She said, "Does he play that?" And we said, "Yes." And she asked him to play something. She was so impressed with what he could do on the violin that she gave Aaron the violin that she had made for her as a child so that he could get a better tone out of it. People who didn't shun us, people who didn't run away from us, people who reached out to us. That was God in action. With him. That's right. I was. This has a local interest, Deborah. I was remembering the other day, Don Nelson, who's the coach of the Milwaukee Bucks, used to live around the corner from us in Natick, Massachusetts. And there was a summer when Don Nelson's son and 2 other boys from the neighborhood would come and play catch and play stickball in our backyard with our little son who couldn't run and couldn't slide and couldn't do any of these things. And they never gave him a break. They never made it easier for him. They treated him as an equal, and that was really so gratifying for Aaron.
Sure. Now, at the same time, during this experience, you had a daughter. In fact, you found out about Aaron's death, that he was going to die, on the day your wife gave birth to Ariel, right?
That's right.
And now, how did you deal with this girl? When he died, she was 11 years old. All this attention was being directed to Aaron. How did you deal with Ariel during this whole time?
Badly. Deborah, I have to confess, we did a lot of things wrong because we were just so emotionally involved in Aaron's problem. I'm not sure any person could have done it better. You're so limited in your own human capacity. Your energy is your time. What happened was we focused on Aaron because our time with him was so limited, and I guess we unconsciously said, well, we'll get around to Ariel when Aaron is no longer there to make demands on us. We focused on Aaron because he was desperately ill, because he couldn't dress himself, because he had to be taken to doctors. And you know what happened, Deborah? Ariel, when she was a child, got the message that if you're sick, people pay attention to you. And she would fall down and break her wrist, and she would get all sorts of diseases, and she'd develop asthma and allergies and wheezing spells, just to make sure that we had time for her.
Do you know at the time that's why she was
doing We sort of half understood it. I think she sort of half understood it. In addition, she tells the story, Aaron was a very strange-looking child. The disease progeria kept him tiny, the size of a 3-year-old. He weighed 25 pounds when he died at the age of 14. He was a teenager who had to shop for clothing in the toddlers section of department stores. When they were little, Ariel would go around with her brother, and people would stare and point and giggle, and she thought they were laughing at her. She thought that there was something wrong with the way she looked, and she's been terribly self-conscious about it. She was jealous of a child who was in pain and dying, and she felt so guilty for being jealous of this. But it's a syndrome that's really very hard to avoid. She's had a difficult life. We're trying to get things together now. We're working on another book as a sequel to When Bad Things Happen. My wife and I and Ariel are contributing to a biography of Aaron, the story of his life, how it affected our family, what it was like to raise a handicapped and dying child, and what we did right and what we did wrong.
I imagine that's opening some wounds as far as Ariel's concerned that she never ever opened up before.
Oh, Ariel's marvelous. Her stuff is the best stuff in the book,
Yeah.
Deborah. My wife and I see Aaron as almost a saintly character, so brave and so smart and so wonderful. And Ariel remembers what a bratty, bossy older brother he
Normal
was.
sibling rivalry.
Absolutely, and that really brings everything down to earth. She tells the story, for example, that once we were planning a trip to Israel, and people gave Aaron and Ariel presents, the portable folding toothbrushes that you could tuck in your pocket. And Ariel was a good little girl and said, "Oh, thank you very much." And Aaron said, "This is so small, who needs this?" And everybody laughed and said he was so cute. And Ariel realized had she said that, she would have been spanked and sent to her room.
That must have been really tough for her, though.
It was. And Aaron was verbal. He was very quick with insults. He was jealous of her for being normal, for having friends, for doing all these things, for growing, for being bigger than he was. He could hurt her with words, and she was not as verbally adept, and she could never hit him, no matter how angry she was.
Did you ever feel guilty afterwards?
I don't think so. I'm really not a very guilt-prone person. I think when I had to work through the theological problem, that is, what kind of God lets a child suffer like this, when I came to my conclusion that God doesn't cause it, that I'm not being punished for my sins, when I came to the conclusion that God is kind and fair but doesn't cause the senseless things that happen in the world, that left guilt behind, except for the sort of thing we've talked about. I wish I had spent my time differently with my children. I read a wonderful interview with a 98-year-old woman in Kentucky recently. She was asked, if you had your life to live over, what would you do differently? Her answer was, I would eat more ice cream and less beans. I think my answer would be, I would be less concerned with being the world's best rabbi and more concerned with spending time with my children. Our goal the last few years was our time with Aaron is limited. We've got to use it well. I think we tried very hard to do that.
But do you think in writing this book, this is only because you wrote the book and started getting all your thoughts together, that you came up with all these ideas, what you should have done? And what has the book done for you as far as making you even more of a total being?
A couple of things, Deborah. First of all, I felt good writing it. A lot of things I got out of my system, a lot of things I clarified in the process of writing it. Most importantly, I believe that there was no purpose to Aaron's death. It was not part of any grand design. I cannot believe that God afflicted my son with a terminal illness that caused him to live in pain and die at age 14 in order to make me a more sensitive person. And yet I have the choice about what kind of life I want to leave after Aaron. And I have felt that if I could take this meaningless tragedy, the death of a child, and redeem it from meaninglessness by turning it into something which will help a lot of people. If I could write a book which tens of thousands of people will read and be comforted by, then I've taken Aaron's suffering, and by my choice, not by God's design, by my deciding what I want to do about it, I've turned it into something much better.
That's beautiful, but was that hard to do?
The alternative would have been harder. To leave Aaron's death an unredeemed tragedy would have been more than I could bear. And so I've got to do something with it.
Okay, I asked you before about guilt. In the book, you cite a couple who have a daughter, went to college, perfectly healthy, beautiful, 19 years old, on her way to class. She has a brain hemorrhage and dies. And you went and visited her, and they felt terribly guilty. They missed their fast, or they didn't fast.
I walked into the apartment not knowing what I could say to these people to comfort them. Their first words to me when they saw me were, Rabbi, you know we didn't fast last Yom Kippur. What they were doing, of course, was blaming themselves. They were saying implicitly, we violated some obscure law, and God is punishing us for it. They must have been tremendously angry at God and afraid of admitting they were angry at God, so they turned their anger at themselves. The worst thing that religion sometimes does, because religion has standards, because religion defines right and wrong, it plays into our natural instinctive tendency to blame ourselves. It leads us into this mistake of every time a bad thing happens, saying, it's my fault, I'm being punished for my sins. The ludicrous example is the mother whose child falls down at a playground and says, you see, God made you fall down for running away from your mother.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, you're going to raise people to believe in a God like that. Or the story I tell in the book about the 11-year-old boy who discovers he needs glasses and is very upset because 2 nights before he found a copy of Playboy magazine in the trash and was looking at the pictures, and he really believed God was striking him blind for looking at those naughty pictures. It's true, by the way. I know the family. But you see what happens? We're so desperate to make sense of the world. We would like to believe that everything that happens in the world makes sense. And if the only way to make sense of the world is to say we deserve it, we will do all sorts of horrible things to ourselves. We'll make ourselves the villain in order not to face up to the fact that the world is senseless. Those headlines you read at the beginning of the show, and you could have picked any newspaper at random. You wouldn't have to look very far, from the world news to the local deaths, automobile accidents, murders, muggings, for that matter, to the Bears' Sunday score. There are all sorts of tragedies going on. They're senseless. You try and make sense. You try and explain why they're good, and you end up with so distorted a definition of good that you've just defined yourself beyond the bounds of reason. People who try to justify the Nazi Holocaust by saying, well, it was to teach the Jews of the world not to be assimilated. It was to stimulate the world into giving us the state of Israel. Now, maybe those things happened after the Holocaust, but is anybody going to claim that the only way God could make this happen was by having innocent Jews, by the millions, tortured and put to death, centers of Jewish piety and learning destroyed? It's horrible. It's verging on obscene and blasphemous
to say that these things should
happen.
You deal with that in the book.
Why did the Holocaust happen? I can only believe that it's an instance of human beings misusing their freedom. You see, Deborah, in order for us to be human, different from animals, different from robots, different from computers, we have to be free to choose whether we want to be good. God doesn't program us to be good. If we decide to be honest, unselfish, generous, loyal, studious, self-disciplined, we get the credit for it because we've chosen. We didn't have to be like that.
Like
we
you've
could just
taken
as
the
easily.
bite.
That's right. We could just as easily be lazy and selfish and cruel and destructive. And sometimes people do choose to be lazy and selfish and cruel and destructive. Sometimes people choose to mess up their own lives. Sometimes people choose to mess up the lives of people around them. Sometimes they will mess up an entire community out of their cruelty and their vindictiveness. That's the way I understand the Holocaust. I quote this wonderful German Lutheran theologian, Dorothea Zola, a German theologian, a Protestant, writing about the Holocaust, says, which side was God on? It is blasphemous to say that God was on the side of the Nazis, that he wanted them to do the things they did. You have to believe that God was on the side of the victims, and I do. All victims. The victim of a robbery and a mugging, the victim of a drunk driver, the victim of a malignant tumor. I can't believe that God wants these cruel things to happen. I must believe that he's on the side of the victim.
So where does God fit in there? Will God give that victim the strength to run? Will God give him the strength to give talks on how to prevent rape after that?
I'll tell you a story, Deborah. I more or less jog. And last Father's Day, my daughter Ariel gave me a T-shirt to wear when I jog, on the back of which she had imprinted Isaiah 40:31. I don't know if you remember that, what passage that is. If you check your Bible, Isaiah 40 verse 31 reads, "Those who trust in the Lord will have their strength renewed. They shall run and not grow weary."
That's wonderful.
I turn to that when I jog, but more than that, I see this happening all the time. I see people in my congregation, ordinary people, not terribly pious, not terribly religious, not very well educated Jewishly. When they need to be brave, somehow they get courage they didn't have the day before. When they need to be patient and loyal, they learn loyalty. Where do they get these qualities that I and they know they did not have before, unless somehow God is giving us the qualities we need? If we can get over being angry at him, if we can get over being estranged from him because of the tragedy, if we can just understand he is on our side and wants to help us and let him help us, he does renew our strength so that we can run and not grow weary.
And what about the argument that people say, oh, the wicked get it in the end, the righteous, sooner or later, they will be redeemed? You give the example, it's beautiful, about the blade of grass that grows so quickly and it supersedes or it surpasses the palm tree. But the palm tree eventually will grow slowly and will be a sturdy cedar.
It's not my example, of course. It's Psalm 92, the Psalm for the Sabbath day. Against that, I think it's a great idea. I think it's true, by the way, that ultimately a bad person trips himself up. The question is, what do you do in the meantime? I have to cite John Maynard Keynes, that in the long run, all of us are dead. Some of us simply are not in a position to wait out God's mill of justice grinding so slowly. I give the example in my book of the man whose business went bankrupt because he trusted a loyal friend and customer who let him down. A man in his 50s, he has one child in college and one child ready to go to college next year. He has nothing to do for a living anymore. You can say to him, in the long run, this will work out. Your friend who is dishonest will be caught up with. You who are honest will work things out. But in the long run, to a man who's 54 years old, has college tuition bills to pay, no longer has health insurance, worried about getting older, how much of a long run can you ask that person to wait for? That's another one of those pious answers which I really don't think are very comforting.
Yeah, it's hard, and I'm sure these people come up to you, and you're probably at a loss. What can you do? You talked about another loss. I'm glad we're citing examples from here. The woman who spent 6 years collecting antiques to open her store, she finally does, and a fire destroys everything.
A bolt of lightning sets a fire which destroys the whole block, and people tried to say to her, God is sending you a message. By the way, one of the few negative responses to my book came from an evangelical journal where they said, Kushner is wrong. When bad things happen to us, God is trying to send us a message. I think that's exactly the opposite point of view of what I believe. What kind of message is he trying to send to a woman that she's wasted 6 years of her life? Not only can the insurance not replace these antiques, how do you ever pay a woman back for spending 6 years collecting them only to have it all go to waste? How do you tell some of these people who suffer tragedies which will change their lives, God is sending you a message? I give the example of the babysitter who is distracted from watching a child by the side of a swimming pool and the child drowns. What's the message there? Be more careful? Do you really have to take the life of an innocent child to tell babysitters to be careful? It just does not make sense to me. If God is trying to send us a message, I wish either he would get a better means of communication or at least be more explicit what the message is.
Okay, let's say the parents of that child came up to you and said, Rabbi Kushner, our child drowned, the babysitter was sitting there. I don't know how God could have let this happen to us. What can we do? Why did it happen?
Okay, what do I do to people like that? Hold their hand, tell them, I feel so bad for you. It's a terrible, senseless thing. Reassure them that they're not being punished. It's not because you're bad people. It's not because you deserve to have it happen. You don't. You really deserve much better than this. I can say to them with more credibility than another clergyman can, I know how you feel. I know how utterly devastating it is to lose a child and all the dreams you have invested in that child. And then I can say to them, I don't believe that God wanted this to happen. I can only believe that God cries with you when you cry for your drowned child, and that he will try and give you the courage to put the pieces of your life together again. And then I would say to them, when you've gotten the question, why did it happen, out of your system, let's go on to the next question. The next question is, it's happened, what are we going to do about it? What kind of people will we choose to be? Because we have our choice. We have no choice about whether or not our child would drown. That happened without our making a decision. We have a choice about how we want to live our lives. We can be bitter. We can be cynical. We can be envious of people who have healthy families. Again, I quote Dorothea Zola in the book. She has this phrase, the devil's martyrs. That is, in the same way that there are martyrs to God, people who by their death strengthen faith, she suggests there are devil's martyrs. There are people who by their death weaken faith. If you let the death of a child, the death of your husband or wife, the death of a parent or brother, if you let that rob you of your faith in the world's goodness, if you choose to become a disillusioned, bitter, jealous person, you take that person you love and turn him into one of the devil's martyrs. You make his death an instrumentality of losing faith, making the world a less loving place. If, on the other hand, you can say, it's happened, it's cruel, it's senseless, and it hurts terribly, but I want to overcome this. I'm not going to let this rob me of my faith in the life and the goodness of life. Then you take this, as I've tried to do with my son's life and death, you turn it into the soil out of which some sort of blessing can emerge.
That's a beautifully positive note, and that comes through after every page you read. And you yourself, I was telling you earlier that I have a friend who lost a girlfriend in an accident. He lost all faith in God. He just He's lost it. And you said, well, tell us about the reactions you've gotten for the letters you've gotten from reading this book.
It's been astonishing from all over the country, not only Jews, Catholics, Protestants, people of all sorts of religious backgrounds, write me and tell me that for the first time they can be on good terms with God again. People who have not set foot in a church for 10 years. People who have been angry with God ever since they lost a child, ever since they saw their parent die in agony. And they were so angry with God. They write to me and they say, you know, it makes so much sense that God didn't want it to happen, that there are things in the world beyond God's control, that God doesn't choose who will have which particular sickness, God doesn't choose which airplane will crash and which passengers will be on it, but that God is there to help us. That it's not the earthquake and the flood which are the act of God, whatever the insurance companies say. It's the willingness of people to risk their lives to save their neighbors in a flood. It's the determination of a community to rebuild itself after the earthquake. This attitude of, I'm not going to let that ruin my life, I am going to go on, that's the act of God. At the end of the book, I spent a lot of time talking about Archibald MacLeish's play, J.B., where, by the way, one of the nicest
Glad you're bringing it up. I want to talk to you about
one of the nicest letters I've gotten since the book came out was a handwritten note from Archibald MacLeish saying that I'm one of the few people who has understood what he was trying to say in J.B. I'm immensely moved by that. At the end of J.B., instead of ending the way the book of Job in the Bible ends, God gives Job new health, new wealth, new children. Job forgives God for not protecting him, goes back to his wife. Their love, not God's generosity, will create the new children in a new life. As if to say, you can't expect God to weave a magic circle around you and protect you from things which happen to other people. All you can ask God to do is to give you the possibilities for love, for forgiveness, for compassion, and try and make something of this life.
With all this compassion, as wonderful as compassion is, what does suffering do for us? Does it have any positive impact on us?
Not to the point where anyone would choose to suffer. If I had my choice, Deborah, I would have been spared this ordeal. I say this toward the end of my book. I would much rather have foregone all the spiritual growth, not be a best-selling author, not get letters about how I've brought people back to God, not be such a wise and sensitive and compassionate counselor. I would rather be a very mediocre rabbi with an 18-year-old son, which is what I would be if Aaron did not have progeria. If I could choose, I would do that. But we can't choose, and maybe it's a good thing we can't, because we would... somebody said that human beings and rivers go crooked by choosing the path of least resistance. Does suffering do us any good? It can make us wiser. It can make us stronger. Khalil Gibran once wrote that the deeper a groove sorrow carves in us, the more joy we're capable of containing. But I don't think we suffer for that reason. We suffer because we're human beings in a very imperfect world. We suffer because we're vulnerable to illness and accident. We suffer because some of the people around us are cruel and selfish. We suffer for all sorts of bad reasons. The question is not why do we suffer. The question is when suffering comes into our lives, how will we choose to handle it?
I wish more people didn't have to suffer, and but if they do, they at least have something to console them. This is a beautiful book. I wish more people would read it. I read it, and as Rabbi Kushner says, see how long it lasts. You find that the trivial things aren't quite as important. You worry about a hangnail. Oh, this is terrible. You read this book. It gives you hope. Rabbi Harold Kushner, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for sharing when bad things happen to good people. And we hope you join us again.
I'll be happy to,
For
Deborah.
Focus, I'm Deborah Palmer.
Sim,